I see gender as something that's fluid, something that can change. Personally, I believe that gender is related to characteristics and certain traits that people take on, and it has less to do with biology than I think society would want us to believe.
Social-based constructs that are built that segregate females and males, not necessarily by sex, but, what is normal for them to do. Like women are supposed to be in the kitchen and men are supposed to be outside doing certain things. And it normally limits women. It shows inferiority towards women.
The domination of one over the other. It's not always the overt hitting, raping, hurting of people, but it can also be demeaning behavior towards people, so it can be psychological or emotional.
Gender-based violence can happen to anyone.
When there's unequal power relations between two genders.
So because you're a woman or you're a man or you're a particular woman such as a lesbian or a particular man such as a gay man, and you are targeted for that very attribute.
We often hear derogatory terms, for example, used for women, and that is a form of gender-based violence.
In South Africa, men are traditionally given a superior role over women, so we see gender-based violence generally more towards women.
It's inhumane. It says that you are not worthy to be respected, your dignity is not respected. So I feel like it needs to be put to an end, and we need to respect one another as individuals.
If a man beats up a woman, forms of domestic violence, rape is an obvious example, and also can be forms of psychological abuse.
Sexual harassment is definitely a category of gender-based violence where one is using their power inappropriately, wanting sexual favors and threatening the person with their job, with taking away money or reporting them for some or other reason.
It's really when someone invades your autonomy, your agency over your own body, your right to privacy, and infringes on that. And people do it because they feel like they can get away with it because the system and the odds are all stacked in their favor.
This is a serious problem, and everybody has a role to play in ending not only gender-based violence, but every form of gender-based violence, including sexual harassment.
Gender-based violence has to end, and we have to take steps, and we're not prepared to excuse it any longer.
Individuals who feel they are victims of sexual harassment should speak out and seek help and guidance about what to do about it.
You're not alone. I've also experienced it, but the problem is that we don't report it because we feel that we need to protect the people, or it's a norm in society.
Further educate our society. We have to alert people that women should not be objectified. People of other sexualities must not be objectified.
Speak out, speak up.
So a very good day to everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us. My name is Ntabaleng Madela. I will be your moderator for today. It is a great pleasure for me to be a part of the panel discussion, as this is a discussion that I personally am so passionate about. It's a very harsh discussion for us to have, but it certainly is one that we need to shine light on, as today's discussion will be mainly focused around educating our communities about taking responsibility in breaking the Sgbv cycle. There have been many myths and stereotypical attitudes around, sexual and gender-based violence, which have shaped the way in which society perceives and responds to the violence against women. Such myths have resulted in people somewhat blaming women for sex, which is in actual fact very wrong. Some of the myths have also made the victims themselves be doubted for what they have experienced, and finding themselves in positions where they're unable to voice the situations that they have gone through. So it's a really harsh discussion that we're about to have, but is one that we certainly need to have. So Sgbv, for those who are not aware, is one that it's an activity that manifests itself in many forms. It could be physical, it could be emotional, and it could also be in sexual forms. It also includes financial and economic abuse, which is part of the discussion, which we'll also discuss today. So recently, I'm not sure if you have seen, our own police minister, Becky Cele, on Friday said that the educational institutions in our country are becoming a hotspot for sexual violence, with about 380 cases of rape having been reported in schools, universities, colleges, and daycare centers. If we look at what has been going on right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, over 2,300 gender-based violence calls and complaints have been registered at the beginning of lockdown from the 27th of March until the 21st of March. So that is quite a short time for us to be having such high numbers, and only 148 of them having been charged. So today we're going to delve into a very harsh discussion, as this is a very harsh reality in our South African society. Of course, this event is brought to you by the University of Pretoria, and the panelists, which I'll be introducing to you in a moment, are all as well affiliated with the University of Pretoria. UP is very committed to addressing all forms of Sgbv against women and girls to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 5 when it comes to gender equality. The commitment includes protecting all children, both girls and boys, against human rights violations. Please feel free to send any of the questions that you may have throughout the discussion, and I will definitely post them to each of our panelists towards the end of today's discussion. So without any further ado, let me introduce our panel to us. First up, I have Prof. Kupe. Prof. Tuana Kupe is, of course, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria. He's also an active member of several society organizations, which also include investigative journalism, and he has been the chairperson of the Board of Media Monitoring Africa since 2005. Professor Kupe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank
you. Up next, I also have... No. Yes, you can go, Prof. What is your stance on today's conversation?
No, I think that what we're facing here is a pandemic and a civil war. So about 10 or so years ago, when I wrote a newspaper column, I called it Like a Civil War. I've since then changed it a civil war and a pandemic, because people seem to relate to the word pandemic. And because this is because of the resilience of patriarchy. And patriarchy breeds the following: violence against women and children. It also breeds lots of discrimination. I'm calling it a civil war because people actually die on a daily basis because of sexual and gender-based violence. And I also feel that, and I think I'm right to say, if this affected men, men would have used their power as the patriarchs in society to stop this. So what we now need is very urgent, precise, systemic, and individual action to reverse sexual and gender-based violence, which is a violation of women's rights, their dignity, their privacy, and also it undermines and undercuts their ability to contribute to creating a more equal and better society. So everything must be brought to do it. Any progress we make is less progress if women are, I think, in a sense, being the victims in this civil war perpetrated by fellow human beings, including in intimate relationships. So I think that people think that too many things are an emergency and urgent. This is the emergency and this is the urgency because women's rights are women. It is important also, I think, going forward, as Ms. Mkebeleng said, and thank you for moderating, that UP has tried to bring together a number of things, including our anti-discrimination policy. But Pierre, David, and Sarah on the panel, and Dr. Linda Brokian, who will join us, will tell you that is not even enough. The problem still, in a sense, persists. So what we have to do actually is to say it's not even a redoubling, it's a retrabling of all of our efforts and to integrate them in such a way that we begin to see a decisive difference going forward. Because we can't sit every month and have a happy Women's Month when actually the problem worsens. Because that is, if you like, we need a happy Women's Month is a very good thing. It concentrates our minds. But the danger is the following: that we simply tick the box after Happy Women's Month and we walk away. Given this is a pandemic and a civil war, what we need to declare is that every day is a day, every hour is a day fighting SGBV, and every week is, and every month is, and every year until this is eradicated and defeated. If we actually redouble this, I fear a concentrated month which brings it into sharp focus but makes people relax. This is a fight that every individual person ought to critically reflect and say, in what ways am I complicit? In what ways am I not playing my part? It's not enough to say I'm not sexist, I haven't raped anyone, or I haven't done anything. You actually have to take it beyond yourself because this is a societal problem which will only be defeated when no one around you, including yourself, is seen as a perpetrator or is seen as abating by either silence or not taking any action. We don't need just to be not sexist, we need to be anti sexist, we need to be anti patriarchy, we need to be anti violence, we need to be enablers of the potential for women to actually be able to be freed from this couch and also to enjoy all of the human freedoms that men as human beings actually do.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Yes, while Intabalance Network is getting sorted, my name is Sarah Mazeke. I am the Acting Transformation Manager for the University of Pretoria. I've been in this space since 2017, and what I have seen in this institution is exactly what is happening in our country. You know, because as universities, we are the microcosm of the environments within which we operate. So whatever it is that is happening at UP is exactly the pandemic that Prof. Kupe is talking about that is happening in our country. So I am so honored because just to introduce myself, I'm so honored to be in the presence of social justice activists who are here, and all of you are in this space, fighting this war, this civil war, with what God has put in your hands. So I am grateful to be in your presence so that we can be in this together. Because in these times of COVID-19 and this new normal that we are trying to get ourselves accustomed to, it's very isolating to work alone. We are not reaching out well enough into victims and perpetrators as well. So it's very good to be interacting with you and to educate ourselves, share knowledge, and to educate others. So I'm grateful to be in your presence. Thank you.
So perhaps David, you should go next.
I really appreciate that. My name is David Coppola. I'm the president of the Student Representative Council here at the University of Pretoria. On a daily basis, I oversee the student structures that we have at the university. Amongst these structures, there is a student component to hashtag Speak Out UP that exists to create awareness about GBV related issues, as well as training student volunteers to participate under the Center for Sexualities, AIDS, and Gender, which my colleague Pierre will speak to shortly. I very much echo the same sentiments that have been shared by Sarah, that have been shared by the VC. But I believe that in that we do need to go further. I think one of the biggest issues that we have been experiencing is that it's very much been a culture where we are inactive bystanders. For many of us, we believe that if we know the bare minimum, then we are okay. If I know that this is wrong, then I am doing my job and I'm contributing where necessary. The issue is that the person to your left and the person to your right may not know even what the basics are. It is our responsibility to operate within the realm of our influence. That is the only way that you are able to fight a war. You cannot go to one part of a country and fight a war solely in that part when conflicts are erupting all around. And you, in and of yourself, have the responsibility because of the fact that we need to widen our efforts. And if all of us play our parts, it takes a lot of the stress and a lot of the emphasis off of those who are carrying a greater amount of weight. In many respects, you'll find that people tend to lose hope. People give up when they're carrying too much. So we need to share the load to the extent that the load no longer becomes as heavy as it has been right now. And I believe that from a student's perspective, we are the future, we are what is to come, and we have the responsibility that ensures what is to come is positive, is beneficial, and is very much against gender-based violence.
Pierre, I think it's your turn.
Yes, thanks, Prof. Coupe, and welcome, colleagues. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Sexualities, AIDS, and Gender at the university, and a partner, I guess, in our sexual and gender-based violence work on campus. I think, Prof, your introduction made me really think about the fact that really the root of much of the problem is patriarchy, and it is so deeply woven into our society, along with, I think, a particularly violent past and present. And I think that interweaving of patriarchy and violence makes SGBV an extremely entrenched and embedded problem, and one that we cannot fix very easily. Um, and I'm just thinking about in the public domain recent events of high-profile politicians being involved in very unseemly disputes with their partners, which really speak to questions of gender and gender norms and violence. We hear stories of pastors who abuse people in their parish. We hear stories of teachers in schools who are meant to be the guardians of the lives of young people, having sexual relations inappropriately with young people. So, we've got a lot of work to do to unravel these norms, which are so deeply embedded in our society. And I think the other thing that you made me think about was that it's not enough to have a superficial response to SGBV. We need very specifically anti-violence and anti-patriarchy and anti-sexism work. And I think the analogy there is around the recent sort of way in which we've rethought about anti-racist work, which I think in the light of Black Lives Matter, that it's not enough for people like me, a white person, to say, I'm not racist. I have to actually be involved actively in anti-racism work. And I think the same applies to gender-based violence. We need to be actively involved in that work. And part of that work, which is what I've been involved in, particularly with Sarah at UP, is running a series of anti-sexual harassment workshops, also with colleagues from my center, over the last 2.5 years or so. And really, it's been a fascinating journey because it's like a window into beliefs and ideas and practices around gender. And it's been a wonderful opportunity to gain those insights and also to find ways to challenge people in an empathic way, I hope, around some of the stereotypes and beliefs. And I think that sort of goes some way to start to unpack what is really quite an entrenched problem. Intabeling, are you back with us?
Cool.
Do we hand the baton over
Yes,
to you?
I'm back. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. So I took
Yeah.
over while you are away. So I hope you can look at the
My
video and
apologies. Both my backup internet and both of them actually just bombed out on me for a bit. So has every
Prof. Coupe, do you want to jump in with a question about data? What do we know at UP about statistics?
Yeah. So just generally, it's interesting in that if you look at the student side, you could say that UP has achieved gender equality. 55% of our students are actually female. And let me say, Mr. President David, that students actually in general also do better than the male students. But also this might mask the fact that women also often have to jump all of the gender-based forms of discriminations, and that 55 might not be reflective of all the degree programs. You find often certain degree programs then default back to a man being a majority in the class in fields like engineering and related ones. And so one mustn't be complacent in that regard. When it comes to the female staff, it's not that we don't have a majority of female staff, but they are often in the lower ranks. And also, for example, if we take professors or A-rated professors, the very top, out of the 15 or 16 we have at UP, only 3 are A-rated professors. The rest are men. And that is reflective also of the what I call the pyramid. But let me just, before I go that far, that people forget that women are a majority of the human beings in the world and in South Africa. Actually, the correct statistic is more closer to 52% of the population is women. But when it comes to the power hierarchies, including in the universities, it defaults back again to men being dominant. So you could say a minority often rules when the majority is at the lower ranks. I think 30% of our academics, 30% or thereabout, are professors. So the other 70% are male. And being a professor is reaching the height of your, and also professors often might be heads of department, they'll be directors of institutes and all of that. So the problem actually, in a sense, is reflective of what you find in society. When a majority of the powerful, influential positions, men hold the sway, and women do not hold the sway. And so what we're trying at least my vision at UP is that over time accelerating is that we have programs that support women in leadership. Next week also we're having a women in science leadership where the keynote speaker have invited Professor Tuli Madonsela, who is a social justice chair at Stellenbosch. Because we really have to get into the granularity of how patriarchy operates at the everyday level. Because if you stay at simply the macro level, you might actually see, and they might not be bad. They are good indicators even at UP. But is this a sustained momentum that actually eradicates? Because in my vision, you eradicate sexism by dealing with patriarchy in all its forms and where it manifests itself.
I think that was absolutely brilliant. And if I can give my 2 cents, I like how Prof. Coupe has very much outlined it. I do think that in dealing with data pertaining to gender based violence, it's important to understand the data that we're looking at, meaning that I believe the first place to start is ensuring that even in the limited data that is available, that it is the accurate data. Once you've obtained the accurate data, you move forward to try and expand the scope of the data. I'll give an example. In the latter stages of 2019, from a student perspective, we used the word lit because it was absolutely lit. Everything that was happening all around the country was very much referred to as a GBV explosion. I still maintain the belief that it was not an explosion, it was simply a greater light that was shining on already existing issues, much like if we gave the allegory of George Floyd. It's not that these were issues happening in isolation, it's that the one time someone happened to be there with a camera highlighting what was already happening. Now, what happened was a lot of activism within the student space. All around the country, students were taking to the streets. There was running, there was protesting, there was a lot of agency being sought amongst young people. The issue then came in that there are always instances where data is misconstrued. For example, I remember getting up at 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 in the morning at very odd hours, and I would get various pieces of information, and they would go viral on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. X person was abducted at this corner on this street by this car. And then when we go and we would check with the police in the area, we find that either the claims were unfounded or that there had been no claims that had been laid in. Now, the difficulty there, and this is where it gets dangerous, is even with the limited data that may be available, if we are all using limited data, but that data is inaccurate, it prevents us from going forward to expand the scope of data. If I go and I make a false claim and I lay this claim and my claim is found to be wrong, the next time I come with accurate numbers to try and increase the scope of what I'm saying, you are less likely to believe me. And I believe as far as possible, that is a responsibility that each of us can take. And that's basically ensuring that we fact check ourselves in the data that we have available.
Thank you so much, David. Yes, Sarah, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I would like to add to that in the work that we do, it's data is very important, because when we do not have correct information, like David said, it is not very easy to really manage the space. And if David can remember, I remember there was a time we were doing an activation at the amphitheater in here at UP Hatfield campus after the Uyinene movement. And while we were doing that activation, it was like we were trying to burn out fires because students were really up in arms. During that time, we realized that there were a lot of students who were accusing the university, saying the university is not doing anything about gender-based violence. And then after the amphitheater activation, we realized that all the rape cases and the sexual harassment cases that the students were alleging to, they were never reported. So how can the university have enough information and data so that we can be able to intervene when we don't even have the information of the students who are raped and sexually harassed in classes, in lecture rooms, or even in residences? So having data is very important, but if people do not report cases, they are really, hamstringing us, because we can't really do much. Like Dr. Blockland, if she comes and joins here, the psychosocial support that is available for the students and for the staff members can never be accessed by the students or the staff if they never report. And the other angle of data availability that is a real challenge for me in my work is the availability of a sexual offenders list. We are limited in that, and the Poppy Act is also limiting us in that, because I end up finding that a lot of perpetrators, especially if it's employees or staff members that I encounter, already had cases from where they came from. But we appointed perpetrators into our yard, but we are limited from really going and checking the background of such people. But now these people are now coming here, and it's like we are bringing a lion into a lamp scroll. So that the limited data. That is my angle on that, and it's a real challenge in gender-based violence, because when you don't know, you can't intervene. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Sarah. Pierre, would you also like to add in on that?
Thanks. I think the question of data is fascinating. I have two quick reflections. I think the first one is it's important to subject our data to levels of scrutiny and analysis. I'm thinking, I remember a transformation discussion that Prof. Kopano Ratele hosted at UP a few years ago. And he said it's not enough to just have brown bodies or queer bodies or female bodies inside an institution. In a sense, it's whether that institution is inclusive of those bodies and whether those bodies have power. So sometimes gender analyses of gender equality might engage in a counting exercise. And I think Prof. Kupe, you quite rightly said it's whether those women have power inside the institution. And so I suppose it speaks to the question of the institutional culture. Is it actually progressive? Is it open-minded? Is it inclusive? Does it adapt as it shifts and evolves? And I think that's one way of thinking about data. And the second thing was around, I think just recently, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, today, the Department of Higher Education and Training has released a framework for universities to think about how they can respond to SGBV. And actually, there's an interesting statement somewhere which says most incidents of SGBV where students are concerned actually happen outside of the university context, not inside, because obviously outside in the world, that's where stuff happens. So if you just looked at that statistic, you could say, well, then we don't have a responsibility. It's somebody else's job. But in fact, we do have one. And I think that introduces for me the idea about a moral imperative around SGBV. That as an institution, even if there aren't large amounts of SGBV that we've documented, we still have a moral ethical duty to create a safe and welcoming environment for all the bodies that come onto our space. But having said that, I think good data is crucial to a good response.
Yeah. So if I might add, Daveling, if you don't mind, the one thing we've
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dapir. And you touched on something that was quite relevant there. You spoke about, responsibility, who becomes responsible in such situations. And Prof. Kupe, as the Vice Chancellor of the university, what role do you believe institutions should be playing in such heart-pressing issues?
Okay, I think quite a lot of responsibility. I always say we have a duty of care towards both the staff and students. So we have a responsibility to have our own institutional framework, and PA just referred now to the GB framework of which has been created by the national government. I've read it myself as well as soon as I received it and passed it on to relevant executives, and I'm glad PA also received it. That means it's because that's part of the problem in these things is that if a frameworks, policies, actions don't reach Sarah or PA or David, people will not know. And I've worked in university since I was 25. Often that is part of the problem. So we also have a strong anti-discrimination policy. When I read the GB framework of the government, I was very pleased because many of the things that
Yes,
you said they are in there actually already.
yes,
But the challenge now is to translate it into actual
Yes.
action on the ground. And I think here I would like to pick on what the data issue that they raised. So, for example, Sarah pointed out as David as well, and I think Pierre implied it as well, is that often people do not report. What we have to do there is to go drill down. Why don't people report? Because they don't know there's the anti-discrimination policy. So when we passed it last year in September at a council meeting, I said this is the beginning, not the end. And I said I want every head of department, every dean to tell me that there has been a session. If Sarah has the time and she's at the moment she's been the only one, so I'm coming to that point now, is that it must be owned by everybody who has any sort of power and any person in the institution. And it's my responsibility to keep pushing that because lack of awareness, as you know, results to lack of reporting and therefore to data that is actually not useful. Now, like PS Point and Sarah and David also implied, the data must translate into social understanding, into social critique. The social critique must translate into advocacy campaigns. So this is what my responsibility, our responsibility, is that at the moment, Sarah said she's acting transformation manager. And this has been the situation since I arrived last year. We have to transform that situation in the first place. Create a transformation office that is capacitated enough to be able to work with the Center for AIDS, Gender and Sexualities, the Center for Child Law, the Center for Human Rights. Because funny enough, in universities, we often have the intellectual and spaces and people like Prof. Kutura in sociology, in politics, who teach these things. But these things are then not used internally to change the situation, which is very funny. And actually not funny given we're facing a pandemic and a civil war. So I see our responsibility, my responsibility as the VC, is to orchestrate a coordination and integration of any structure in the university, any institutions, any persons with knowledge of this to create the critical mass and the movement that says at UP, we're on a decisive route to eliminate and eradicate this. Because this is not about, we have reduced it. It's not about reduction, it's about eradication because only in eradication do you actually make the social justice space. I'm very, for Ethiopia, I'm very hopeful because one has to be hopeful. You can't be pessimistic about the social issue. You can't be pessimistic about anti-sexism. That we can marshal together a number of units and individuals and groups who can form the UP movement. Speak out, speak up, and eradicate SBPV.
Thank you so much, Professor Tawana. Sarah, I'd like you to add on that if you can, because as acting transformation manager, you deal with the disciplinary assessment of sexual and gender-based violence. What would you say are the key game changers to ensure that gender-based violence prevention and response in society is actually prioritized?
yes. Prof said it all in one sentence. Lack of awareness leads to lack of reporting. Education and awareness is the key thing in gender-based violence. That is the weapon that we have in fighting gender-based violence. And I always take this very personally because when I was growing up, in the 70s and 80s, I never knew anything about gender-based violence or child abuse. And I ended up becoming a victim of sexual violence and gender-based violence. Now, it will amaze you today, in this age of information and the age of social media, and the world has become one place, the television, in everything. People have information at the fingertips of their Android phones. They can Google and check out what this means and what is it that I heard and all that, but people are still not educated. And what I can tell you is that if you don't identify and define what gender-based violence is, it will hit you in the face and you will never even recognize that it was gender-based violence. So for me, the key game changer is awareness and education. Because once somebody is aware of what it means for gender-based violence, because even today people say gender-based violence, they think of femicide because they see it on TV. They don't think about sexual harassment, and they don't think about intimate partner violence and all those different facets of gender-based violence. So understanding and knowing what gender-based violence entails and getting to understand and learning about it, you are able to see it when it comes, because peer always educates on the sexual continuum. When we do our module, it's a sexual continuum. Most of the time, sexual violence or rape or sexual harassment is not a surprise. You see it coming before it hits you. But if you are able to have information and knowledge of what can make sexual harassment happen and what behaviors can lead to sexual harassment, you can be able to recognize it when somebody is grooming you to finally really sexually harass you. And then you are able to run away, call for help, so people can play a role of prevention themselves by educating themselves. We, as we educate people, are able to impart knowledge into people. And as we impart knowledge into victims and we impart knowledge into perpetrators, we are able to do a paradigm shift of what society has taught us. Because when we were growing up, men have been socialized to believe that this is the way they should be behaving towards
Yes.
women. And we have also been socialized as
Yes.
women to believe that this is the way, and this is the way I'm supposed to accept how men behave. And therefore, when these things happen, and I don't know that this is gender-based violence, I think it is normal behavior. Therefore, I don't report it. Therefore, nothing changes.
Sure. Sure. Yo, Sarah, thank you so much. You touched on so many key points there, especially the one of education and awareness. We definitely do live in an era of information, and whether that information is right or wrong is also the very big question, because I'm a firm believer that we are a product of the content that we consume, whether it be from books, TV, social media, but we do live in a time where content is easily accessible. But now, is that content shaping a narrative that is perpetuating the same culture, in society? I don't know about you, but I grew up in the days of, example, Yizo Yizo. And I'm quite grateful that my parents, didn't actually allow me to watch that TV program at a young age. But as I grew older and I actually got a chance to see an episode or two, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, what psychological impact do programs such as those, for example, actually have on the society? And even today, we still find TV programs that haven't changed that narrative. So I want to pose the question to each of you. Do you believe that television, movies, magazines, all forms of media have shaped the view of men, women, boys, and girls in how they respond to sexual-based violence today?
I'll jump in there first because I'm a professor of media studies. So um, on, I'm also literature, by the way. So I'm on the witness stand here. I think that is one of the things that is fundamentally important. And I like what Sarah said about that and what we should do about it. So let me start with what we should do about it and then get back to the core of your question. What we need, and you said it as well, Devlin, there's a superabundance of information, but is this information actually diverse in relation to social justice issues? So what we need is actually to teach everybody critical information and media literacy for people to be able to consume critically. And I like what you said, Devlin, because most of us are hit by these loads of information. but we actually have no means of actually critiquing the information and relating them to us. And so, now to answer your question, the problem with lots of media, and is the full spectrum, including some books and other things, the memes that people are sending all around is that they often normalize and carry the stereotypes, gender stereotypes, patriarchal interpretations of life. They even sexualize, situations, and also sexualize women and commodify them, which actually is part of the apparatus that perpetuates patriarchy, sexism, and gender-based violence. They don't actually critique them. It's not seen as a problem. It's actually, instead of actually critiquing, reflecting societal actions as problems, they simply reflect them as they are. So I always say when I teach media studies that I ask the question, does media question the social order and all of its prejudices and discrimination, including sexism, or does it reinforce it? Progressive media would actually question it, whereas most media actually, in a sense, reinforce it. People walk away saying, yeah, the woman was violated, but this is what happens in society. It was really sad. It was really unfortunate. But people shouldn't do that, but they walk away. Right. Well, whereas what we need is a media which actually, in a sense, problematizes it and puts it at your
Yes.
door. Would you still want to suffer that? Don't say that it was just somebody else. But on the other hand, as well, we then need now to create from early childhood development critical media and literacy courses and as resources for people. You see, media come at you. They are a lot and they look like you can't live with them. But you have no means of actually making a judgment and a distinction between what is right and what is wrong. And it's not everything that is there, by the way. Often it's often the thing or too much of what should not be there, which reinforces the social order, if you like. So I think that Ethiopia have been suggesting to colleagues that part of our campaign against sexism, SGBV, is going to be critical media and information literacy. Where are you getting your knowledge about? Where are you getting your awareness about? What is contextizing you? What's problematic with your media diet and information diet? Should it not be much more diverse? And what is missing? And these days, by the way, we have the ability to create our own media. People do it every day through their phone cameras, their WhatsApp messages, and everything. People are creating stuff and circulating it. But which framework are they using? Are they taking an anti sexist, anti discrimination, pro gender equality agenda into those spaces? Because, funny enough, as Sarah said, there's more information at our fingertips and there's greater capability to create information. Those who create must have their own agenda, which is reinforce the social order. We need to say we want to upend the social order and
Yes.
put gender equality, anti-violence, anti-sexism, anti-harassment, sexual harassment, anti-GBV at the agenda. So there's greater choices for people to make from in order to reach. Because really, we're really talking about creating a new society devoid of SGBV, devoid of inequality. And information and media are powerful tools in that respect.
True. Thank you so much, Professor Tuane. David, I'd like to rope you in there as well. What is your take on the media that we have to our disposal today as society, and how do you feel that it's shaping the narrative and the mindset?
I appreciate that. I think there's a dichotomy that exists when we're looking at the various forms of information and media that we have available. I believe it shapes our perception, and the perception and the views that we have to do with exactly what we're exposed to. Now, the dichotomy I'm referring to, I would draw a line between the first half of the question and the second half. So the first half being magazines, TV, books, all of that, and I would draw a line there. And on the other side, I would put the internet, because we're living in the era of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, what happens very often, and I've seen this amongst ourselves as students and amongst young people, is we have the tendency to operate within our own echo chambers. And because we operate in our own echo chambers, it reinforces the particular views that we have. So the first part of the dichotomy, I think, as you grow up, you are not able to choose as much as you would like to what it is you're exposed to. So for example, if your parents are working, you're at home, you're watching TV, you're exposed to certain images, that tends to shape the perception that you have. Now, for many young people, you take this perception and it goes with you as you grow. Now, you're able to pick up your phone and you're able to access any kind of information that you want. This means that we have an information bias that is inherent. Now, within that information bias, every source of information that I look at, I look for sources that will reinforce the bias that I have. The more sources I find, the more I carry on with that particular form of bias. Meaning that now it creates a situation where when I am in a space of confrontation, where I am told that, you know what, this is not okay, this is not cool, you shouldn't be saying this, or you should consider that, I can easily pull out a variety of sources, and I genuinely believe in the sources that I am portraying, which is why, as far as possible, I believe that with all of the information that is out there, it is very, very important, as Prof. Coupe alluded to, that we develop and we try and train sensitivity as far as possible. And again, I'll refer to what I had touched on in the beginning and what everyone here has spoken about, that we each have the responsibility. For example, you might be going through your Instagram feed, and all of us have that one friend that will post memes that are just absolutely not okay. Small instances that we tend to brush off, you know, you can shoot a DM and say, that is not cool, that is not funny, and you will be confronted on that. And within that space, it is important that you have the relevant information and the understanding that you can carry over to whomever you are engaging with, so that we can get to a point where the information that we are exposed to and the information that we are able to choose, because I do believe largely we are able to choose what information we want to follow, be it the right information or the wrong information. So creating a space where we can facilitate that all of us are expanding the scope of information that we have and using information positively to combat SGBV as far as possible. We need to call each other out. We need to challenge toxic masculinity, and we need to ensure that information is not parochial.
Thank you so much, David. I love the fact that you said we really need to call each other out. But one thing that Sarah pointed out quite loudly also was the fact that a lot of people don't call it out. A lot of people are afraid to come forward. And Sarah, I want to ask you, why do you feel that victims of gender-based violence often remain silent about the abuse that they have experienced? And what can actually be done to help them to feel more comfortable in actually being able to speak out?
Fear. Fear in many aspects. You know, if Dr. Blockland was here, she will tell you that we work hand in hand, me and her. It's all about people believing different narratives, and this is what peer also educates on. The fear that no one will believe me, you know, the fear that somebody will tell you, even the police, you know, you go to the police to try and open a case, and they tell the person, what were you wearing? What were you doing? Why were you walking in that alley at night alone? Why did you go to that club and drink alone? All those judgments and all the narratives in people's heads. And it will amaze you that we as women, we fight and we chant gender-based violence must stop. But as women, we also shame one another. You know, a woman can tell another woman that you were wearing a miniskirt, no wonder this was happening to you. So all those narratives that come and the judgments that come from men and from women, they make people to be fearful of speaking out. So the fear and that silence, it really paralyzes victims, and people decide, you know what, I'm not going to talk. And the key thing in relation to fear is the strengthening of the victims. The psychological strengthening of the victims can really counteract that fear. You know, what I do in my space is when people come, somebody will come and try and report, says, no, my friend is going through this or this person. And then you go into that counseling mode that you actually end up making the person to ultimately say, no, it's actually myself. And sometimes when victims even come and speak about something else, I will send them to Dr. Blockland or cancel them myself and say, you know what, you need to be strengthened so that you can have that resilience and that fighting spirit. Because gender-based violence is not easy. Reporting is not easy. There is a possibility of re-traumatization. Now you have to tell your story to the investigator, retell your story to the next investigator, explain yourself. Now you are going back. If it was a rape incident, you are going back to that rape, explaining every little act that you went through. That is not easy. It can traumatize a person, and even a person who came to report, they don't come back again. So the strengthening of victims is very key to make sure that they feel that there is somebody there for me. They will understand. They will not judge me and say, why was I opening my cleavage for all people to see? Now I have experienced this. And the other thing that also makes people not to speak is the justice system, the police and the judicial system. People don't believe in it. You know, people don't believe in the judicial system because of the measure that they use, the measure of beyond reasonable doubt. You know, at the university, we use a different measure, but the police and the judicial system uses beyond reasonable measure. Now, tell me, if I was raped in my bedroom and I'm going to report to the police and they say they want evidence beyond reasonable doubt, where will I get the camera in my bedroom to prove that beyond reasonable doubt? And how did I anticipate that my husband will rape me? And even if I was at work, how will I anticipate that I was working night shift and my supervisor raped me in that little corner around the printer room and I didn't anticipate it? So how do I anticipate such an act so that I'm always on call to say I need to gather evidence so that when I go to the system, then I can prove beyond reasonable doubt that I was raped. So those kind of things create fear in victims and they can't report. Because if I have seen my sister reporting a case and it just disappears, what will strengthen me to go back to the same system? But contrary to that, in our system, I'm not saying UP is the best, and I'm talking about organizational systems. We work on a measure of a balance of probabilities. We don't say prove beyond reasonable doubt. We look at the balance of probabilities and say, this could have happened. And if the balance of probabilities goes beyond, it goes 51%, then we have a case. We are not saying prove 99% that you were sexually harassed. So a belief in the system can really remove this fear and people will start to speak out. So that emotional strengthening, the psychological emotional strengthening of people will really remove that fear because people want to report, but something else is really making them not to believe in whatever system that they see.
Sure. Thank you so much. Pierre, would you like to add in there as well? Because I know that you deal a lot with issues of human rights, sexual and gender identity. How can we actually help victims to be more comfortable to speak out?
Well, I think, adding on to Sarah's points, which I think are all very salient, another aspect I think is shame, particularly in people who've been raped, for example. It's incredibly exposing to go through the criminal justice and reporting system. And you have to often recount what happened to you over and over again, deal with not always being believed or being subjected to intrusive forms of questioning. And I think for a lot of people, it is just too much to endure that process. And so they might, in fact, not even come forward in the first place. We had a case at the center where a colleague accompanied a young woman who had been sexually assaulted by someone she knew. And the police officer who was taking her statement, in effect, made a pass at her and made sexually inappropriate comments. I mean, you can understand, and that those experiences permeate into the community, and people then don't believe that they're going to be treated with dignity. I think another factor which is important is power. When we've dealt with at the university, in Sarah's office and our office working together, sometimes if a student is wanting to report being sexually harassed, for example, by a senior person, and in her, often
Sure.
it could be his department, they will say, I'm afraid of taking this case forward because I'm worried about the repercussions of it. Um, and those repercussions are realistic sometimes, when there's a power imbalance, and quite often perpetrators of sexual harassment are very aware of their power. It can be power around their gender, it can be power around their hierarchy in the system. They're very aware that they can intimidate a victim into not reporting or not being believed. And so I think that is another factor that affects why people can be reluctant to come forward, or even why cases can drag on for a very long time.
David, I have a question for you because you are, the SRC president and you're a voice for many students. Do you feel that young people are actually equipped to deal with gender-based violence and sexual harassment? And do you feel that there's enough access to support and enough tools for young people?
I appreciate the question. To answer the first part, no, I do not think young people are adequately equipped. On the second part of the question, yes, I do believe that there is access. And the reason for that is because to be equipped, it implies that you are able to use tools to your advantage to deal with an issue. If I'm going to write an exam, I equip myself with a pen. Now, the issue then comes in that the pen is still there, but I am not able to equip the pen at the time. And that happens for a variety of reasons. So, for example, I may come to the university space. Within the university space, I may be equipped with parameters that are available. However, I leave the university space, I go home to the township, and within that space, patriarchy is rife. Now, you can imagine when you are in a space where you have been sensitized and you are aware of the different social ills that exist, and now you go to a space where a lot of these social ills are not discussed or remain unaddressed. I've had very many students that I've spoken to. For example, some students would come out and then they go home, and at home it is not a very accepting environment of them coming out. Or in many respects, I would leave home to escape a particular issue, to escape Sgbv violence. Um, and now I have to go back and I have to deal with that kind of space. So I think there's again another dichotomy that we do need to consider as young people. As far as possible, we need to ensure that we create support structures for one another. For example, there are many programs such as peer-to-peer counseling programs where myself as a young person can go and I can be taught how to be there for another young person that may need assistance. Because when I go home, the same support that I would have had within the university space does not exist. However, I may be aware of a friend of mine that had undergone that particular form of sensitization and training, meaning I can easily pick up my phone, shoot a WhatsApp, and say, this is the situation that I'm dealing with. One of the biggest problems that young people experience in relation to SGBV is that of isolation, the feeling that I am alone. Because I am alone, there's no one I can turn to. And if there's no one I can turn to, it does not help to speak out about my issue. So I think very slowly, if we can acknowledge that, again, in the second part of the question, that the tools are there, the tools are available, we need to try and ensure, as Dr. touched on, that we are able to equip ourselves to deal with that. Lastly, on this point, one of the biggest questions I would always get is I go home and I don't have the support, but I want to teach those within my immediate surrounding. We're always saying it starts at home, but how can I help if, as a young person, given the makeup of a lot of the cultural aspects of South Africa, as a young person at home, it's very difficult to demonstrate a level of agency. So how can I create agency within my space? And I very much believe it is engaging with various young people within your space at home. So home can be your home in your household, but home is also the community that you are in. And if you can connect with more young people in the community, then you will be able to start developing levels of agency that did not exist. And eventually, these young people, we will carry on that agency. We will establish that agency. and as far as possible, institutionalize that kind of agency both at home as well as within the campus space. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate you giving your spreading your light on that. Pierre, I want to speak to you a bit as well because you also deal a lot with SGBV in relation to the LGBTQIA plus community. How do we understand SGBV that happens inside the LGBTQI plus community? How do you tackle it in that regard? Because we also need to understand that gender-based violence isn't only when it's male to female, but there are also cases of maybe female to male or male to male. Could you maybe just touch a bit on that for us?
Sure. So, I mean, even before I get onto SGBV within LGBTI people and communities, it's also reasonable to say that a lesbian or gay or trans person could be subjected to sexual harassment or a street harassment without the person even knowing that they are gay or lesbian, for example. But I think, and in some instances, LGBTI people could be targeted precisely because they challenge gender stereotypes and gender norms. So that's another dimension I think is worth mentioning. But within, let's say, the queer family of identities and practices, I think it's reasonable to say that all of us have been marinated in a patriarchal society and have internalized those ideas about, say, gender complementarity in a relationship. Someone is the more masculine, someone the more feminine. I mean, I must say that a number of same-sex relationships reject those ideas, but there are some that would be based on those notions of one person is more male, one person may be more female identified. And in the light of that, they might then act out those gender stereotypes and scripts because that's what they've internalized and seen around them and grown up with. And so, in a sense, it would be the same as if it was a man and a woman, cis man and a cis woman in a relationship. So, and I think another layer one could add to that is the fact that societal oppression, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia is a destabilizing effect for queer people. It leads people to doubt themselves, to not have a sense of their own worth. And I think that also has a further impact on the stability of internalized homophobia, internalized scripts mean that one acts out that violence, in a sense, which is a structural violence, inside the domestic space.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Pierre. Thank you very much. And also, how do we best deal with SGBV against men?
Well, if that question's to me,
yes.
I think it's important to acknowledge that most instances of sexual and gender-based violence are male perpetrators and women as victims. I mean, I think that's the most common instance. But I think we would do male victims a disservice if we pretend that that doesn't exist. And some of the factors we were talking about earlier about why people don't report SGBV is the theme of shame. Men who are subjected to, say, domestic violence in the home, or men who are raped by other men, it's very, very difficult for them to speak out about their experiences. There's a whole cloud and culture of shame around that, because to speak out in effect means I was treated as a woman, I was emasculated by the perpetrator, and for that is sort of ego dystonic for a lot of cis men, straight men to be able to manage. So, I think one way is to take it seriously and to provide services which are sensitive to those particular dynamics, but not, I suppose, at the expense of the bigger problem, which is that most victims are women.
Thank you so much for that. So we have received a couple of comments and questions that have come through from the audience. So I'm going to read them and then we can also address them. So the first comment that has come through is, the problem with SGBV is that it leaves guilt and it leaves the guilt and the feeling with the person who has experienced it being the one who is stigmatized. Hence, people actually die in silence. Would anybody like to perhaps, comment on that? Sarah,
Yeah,
perhaps you?
I can comment on that because that is very personal. We people are different. We are not all warriors and fighters. But I know shame and fear of being a gender-based violence victim, and those things are real. And getting out of it is almost like trying to get out of a depression. So it's not easy, and you can't even talk to your loved ones about it because sometimes even your loved ones don't understand what you're going through, let alone talk to other people out there. So it's very humiliating. Dr. Blockland also commented, shame and humiliation deter young women from reporting experiences of gender-based violence. So it's yeah.
Pierre, would you like to add there?
Just briefly, I think I can recall working with a student who had reported that she had been sexually assaulted, raped, let's be blunt, by her own father over a period of about 2 years in her late teenage years. And she was a fairly masculine presenting lesbian woman. And I understood that the sexual assault was informed by a particular idea of teaching her how to be a real woman, how to be more feminine. Now, you can imagine for someone like that to reveal that experience, not only is it humiliating to have been a victim in that instance, you are calling into question a family dynamic, a relationship with a parent figure. If you were to report that father to the police, often what happens is that the victims believe they are destroying the family because in effect people would say, we don't believe you, it's not true, why are you doing this to your father, he's maybe a breadwinner. So in those instances people choose
Sure.
silence because it is easier for them in a
True.
sense to hold the shame and the blame, but in some ways they are not responsible for destroying the family that they grew up in.
Sure.
So,
Professor Tuana, you wanted to add?
yeah, so I wanted to add that therefore in the institutional design, precisely because of all of these complexities of shame, humiliation, complex family dynamics, we have to pay some attention to how easy is it to report. And that's a very complex institutional thing. If you look at UP with 7 campuses, universities are diffuse by nature, and add to that lack of awareness of existing structures. And then also ease of, so even locating these offices in the university, people don't want to be seen walking into that place where you are reporting XYZ. So some degree of privacy that will enable a person to feel to take the next step. Because I think from what you hear from Pierre, David, and Sarah, people will debate with themselves why suffering a lot before they report. But once they feel the energy or encouragement from somewhere to report, it must then be institutionally easy for them to take that step. And then they must have the confidence that that office or that structure or that space will receive them. So you are paying some attention to that. And Pierre, I think where he works is considered a space like that. So spaces of safety or safety. When I was at VITS, we had even people for gay and lesbian people where they knew that at office wide academic or support staff member, for lack of a better word, so and so, is a person I can go and report, and then they will assist me to access the structures. You need, we spoke about institutional cultures. The institutional culture, changing the institutional cultures have to meet with changing the institutional structures for awareness, reporting, and getting into those kinds of spaces. And then, of course, we have to put some energy into how do we address the institution family context dynamic. Because as PSA, the report shows that many of these instances, not that because it's many, it's not a problem, as you rightly said. Okay, outside people, we all come to university from family context, and most people don't live in race, by the way, including students. So how do we deal with the? How can a person return at the end of the day to family where it happened? Use the university as a resource in order to deal with the family dynamic without being expelled from the family, because there are consequences for all
Yes.
of these things.
Yes, Sarah, would you like to add there?
Yes, this is so key because Pierre said it, or Prof said it earlier, that if people are having problems and the country is having problems on gender-based violence, and somebody's having a problem at home and the student has been raped somewhere else, how is it our business? It is our business because this student will come into this university and perform poorly, and we don't want that. So whatever the social challenges that they are having at their own home are coming into the university's yard. And then that woman whose sexual partner or the husband who is sexually abusing her or raping her at home is none of UP's problem. But that person will come into our UP employee system and they begin to non-perform, and then as HR we begin to say non-performance, and then we try to manage this person out or something like that. But the problem that we are currently having is coming from home, so it is our problem. So the anti-discrimination policy is not just a policy for the University of Pretoria, it is a policy for South African society, because our policy is addressing societal problems for South Africa, not for university. University of Pretoria is a yard. Nobody lives here except for the students who are living in residences. But even themselves, they are just squatting there. We all come from somewhere else and we get into this gate. So when we have these policies available, it is to solve societal problems for our country. So I urge our people to use our own policy to support themselves. Dr. Brockland is available. Dr. Rina Bass is available, because it is our business when you can perform. Even though you were raped by somebody at home or at Devon on a holiday, we need you to come to us, talk to us, and we will strengthen you, even if we can't open a criminal case for you out there because it's your personal problem. But we can strengthen you and help you and give you all the guidance that you need. Our policy needs to solve South Africa's problems.
So, Sarah, perhaps you can maybe help with the answer for this one. The question was, why do people not report when they come to social workers, and how do you actually deal with such situations when a person isn't reporting?
I think Pierre is a psychologist. Pierre is a psychologist. He may be able to help, but the people are not reporting when they are coming to the psychologist. Is that the question?
Yes.
Why are they coming to the psychologist if they are not talking?
Sure.
I'm still asking a question because the person has come to a psychosocial support area for help. So perhaps they are still not strong enough to talk, because even if you get into Dr. Blockland's office today, it doesn't mean that simply by entering her door you are stronger to talk to her. It's a process. It will take time for her to work with you to make sure that you are able, because this is issues of the heart, this is issues of shame. So it's possible, I don't know, David is raising his hand, but it's possible that they go to the psychologist, but they are not yet at that stage where they can open themselves up to be vulnerable to the psychologist. Because now if you are going to be telling these people that your father raped you, now that's a total exposure and vulnerability. So it takes time. Reporting is not for everyone. Although we are encouraging everybody to report, it's not for everyone. Sometimes other people, simply by reporting, they can just break down. I may be wrong in that, but Pierre can weigh in on that. He's a psychologist as well, so.
Okay. There was actually also a comment that came in that said, after knowing what happened to you, people might stop calling you by your name and rather label you as the woman who was raped. That then becomes your identity. So that also raises an issue of some people feel the fear of being shamed after such reporting, right? Pierre, I don't know if you want to add on that. And I know, David, you also had comments that you wanted to add.
Definitely. I mean, if you think about it, rape particularly is a deeply shaming act. It's deepest violation of a person's bodily integrity and their sense of self. It's incredibly difficult to talk about and to expose yourself to other people's scrutiny or comment or judgment. And even just use of words like victim versus survivor. In a conversation recently with a colleague and who herself had been a victim of childhood sexual assault, and she said, there are times when I feel like I like the word victim because I didn't choose to be treated like that by the perpetrator. Other times I feel strong, I feel like a survivor, that I've overcome this. And I think sensitivity to language and to the emotional difficulties and really talking about something deeply personal is something we have to be very, very careful about in how we offer the services to people who do come forward. David, did you want to say
Thank
something?
you. And yes.
Right. So, real quick, I just want to touch on the previous point. Part of the question that was posed spoke about social work in particular. And I do think that within South Africa, we have a lot of professions that help to shape society that are very much undervalued. I think social work is one of them. I think teaching is one of them. I think I believe that psychology is one of them as well. If I look at the amount of people that require mental health assistance versus the amount of psychologists, there's a massive disparity in that regard. Part of my point has been touched on by Pierre in alluding to the type of diction that we use, how we phrase things. For example, if I tell you that I cannot, it is a very discouraging statement. If I tell you I'm going to do everything that I can, then I'm giving you the same message, but I'm giving you the same message in two completely different ways. And I think that translates to these professions in particular, in that they are not very highly spoken of, especially in a lot of very conservative and traditional homes and backgrounds. I remember going through a prospectus for the first time and my mind being blown about the amount of professions and jobs that actually exist outside of the traditional, well spoken of medical doctors and accountants and lawyers and everything of that sort. So I think very much, again, we do have an onus to give greater appreciation to professions such as those that were spoken about, because they play a crucial role in combating GBV as they shape society.
So,
Thank you
if
so
I
much for
may, I
adding
just
there,
wanted
David.
to,
And I think another, yes, Prof.
yeah. So I wanted to
Yes,
talk also
Prof.
about it's a word we haven't used, but we've spoken about it in detail, which is better stigmatization. That many of
Yes.
the discourses that we have stigmatize people, calling people victims and all of that. Even the recent change now, we call people survivors. But still, people want to survive to what? It goes back to
Yeah.
the stigmatization. So the social discourses ought to change with the consciousness and awareness that I can't be a victim forever, even when, even with the limitations of institutional resolution, including a person being arrested, being jailed, that I should be allowed to live on being framed positively in society. And also being a survivor, calling me a survivor all of the time. Let me say that myself, rather than being, characterized perpetually as a survivor, because that again reinforces notions of stigma, shame, that something happened to that person which didn't happen to other people. Yet we know there is underreporting. Others haven't simply said it, but they are also victims and so on. So the language we use and the discourses we use ought also to change if we are to address this problem comprehensively.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for adding there. I know, unfortunately, we don't have Dr. Priscilla with us, who has more insights when it comes to, criminology, because I think it's also important to highlight that part of the reason why some people also don't come forward is if you look at the stats, there are so many cases that are being reported, but not all perpetrators are actually being convicted. So I think also the question we need to also ask is why our law and policies actually fail to protect women and stop GBV. There was actually a comment that came in that says, we opened a case of kidnapping and gang rape last night. This morning, I received a call from the FCS officer saying that they can no longer locate the docket. What do we do in cases such as that?
Well, this is endemic in our country and societies. That let me be frank, our law enforcement not being competent, but also not being competent to the point of criminality. Because how can you lose a docket? Because that is what discourages people from reporting. People will tell you, and report, but nothing is going to happen. Then, but also we cannot divorce this from the fact that the patriarchy also goes into the running of these systems. Let me put it this way, if this affected men, especially men with power, they would have it fixed because it was affecting them personally, if you like. Because it doesn't actually affect them, nobody actually follows through on the promises they make and makes institutions safe. So what that is a point I wanted to make earlier on, that we must be very careful when there are dysfunctional institutions, that we will ask people to go to institutions because people will have lost trust in institutions. And then there's no community support as well. Of course, both have to work at the same time. That you are not only dependent on institutions and worse if they are dysfunctional, that the community itself is supportive, is not stigmatizing, and also shame is not the predominant norm of dealing with issues. We have to fix the institutions because if we don't, basically, what are you left with? And why even bother report? You are actually now, that is what the civil war I was talking about. Because now you are actually on your own and your personal safety, dignity is not guaranteed.
Sure. Yes, Sarah, would you like to add there?
Yeah, I don't want to add to what Prof said. He said it all. I just want us, I see time is really running away. There's one element that I don't want us to leave here without even touching, even just a little bit. Dr. Blockland is not here. She might be the expert in it. But as a social justice activist, I am very worried that me, as a big girl as I am, I can fend for myself and fight off a perpetrator. Now I'm thinking about somebody who's living with a disability, who's sitting on a wheelchair. So these are the excluded people of our community that we never talk about. We do awareness campaigns. I myself, I'm guilty of that. I've done awareness campaigns, and this has been something that has been, it's just that I don't have capacity, but these are things that we need to look into. Having our people who are living with disabilities included in awareness campaigns to be educated, even if they can't do anything for themselves because they are very vulnerable physically, or they can't see, or they can't hear. Sometimes they are even sexually assaulted by their own caregivers. Educating them and giving them resources and tools to say, this is where you can go, this is where you can SMS, anonymously, so that you can get help. So I think this will take a topic on its own another day, but this is an area where we need experts who can help us understand people who are living with disabilities. Dr. Blockland is saying I must focus on cognitively impaired people. People who, I don't know how cognitively impaired, what is it? Intellectually impaired, I guess, maybe. Intellectually impaired. They don't even understand what's happening to them. So those are the people that while we are fighting this civil war for ourselves, we need to fight on their behalf. But we need a bigger and another platform to really go into this area because I really don't understand it myself, but it's a very burning issue for me as well right now.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sarah. Unfortunately, I wish we could continue with the discussion. There's still so much, I think, that's burning in each of our hearts. But unfortunately, we have run out a bit of time. So I'd like to thank you each for being with us today, for joining in on the discussion. David, thank you very much. Sarah, Professor Pupe, I really appreciate you, as well as Pierre. Thank you so much all for your time. I think it's also important that before we go, we do highlight that UP support services are available to everyone. So there's the health and well-being unit as well as the student counseling unit, which are committed to supporting UP employees as well as students, even during these times, to help with any emotional distress that you may be, experiencing at home. So there are numbers that you can contact as well as email addresses. If you should need to contact the student counseling service, the number is 012 420 2333. I'll say it again, 012 420 2333. And should you want to email, is studentcounseling@up.ac.za. Or alternatively, you can also check on the website. Thank you to each of you for being part of the discussion today. We really, really do appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you to you for your moderation. And thanks to my panel members.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.